Alan Jackson's final tour is being presented as the end of a career, but for many people who grew up on traditional country music, it feels like something larger is ending with him. His farewell does not just mark the exit of one artist, it feels like the last slow closing door on a version of country music that once spoke plainly, lived honestly, and did not need to disguise itself as something else to survive. For years, fans held on to Alan Jackson and George Strait as proof that the old spirit of the genre had not completely vanished. They were the artists who still sounded rooted in the same world that had once produced George Jones, Merle Haggard, Johnny Cash, and Waylon Jennings. But now, with Jackson stepping away, many listeners are left facing a truth they have resisted for years. What they loved did not simply age, it was pushed aside. That is part of what makes Alan Jackson's goodbye feel so heavy. It is not just about illness, age, or even retirement. It is about timing. His departure arrives after years of watching country music drift into something many long-time listeners no longer recognize. He warned about that change long before it became impossible to ignore. In 2000, when he and George Strait recorded Murder on Music Row, it was more than nostalgia and more than complaint. It was a direct accusation. It said the heart of country music was being traded away for broader appeal, easier money, and a cleaner, more marketable sound. At the time, some may have treated it as an old-school protest song. Looking back now, it reads more like a prediction. That is why the title of his farewell tour, Last Call, One More for the Road, carries so much emotional weight. It sounds less like a promotional slogan and more like a man acknowledging that the room is nearly empty and the night is almost over. Fans have known for years that the end was coming. They knew about his health struggles. They could see the physical changes. They heard the honesty in his voice when he spoke about becoming more self-conscious on stage and feeling the strain of doing what he had done for decades. But even then, there was a deeper sadness underneath it all. People were not only bracing themselves for the loss of Alan Jackson the performer, they were bracing themselves for what his absence would represent. Long before all of that, before the awards, before the packed arenas, before his name became tied to the defense of traditional country music, Alan Jackson was just a boy in Newnan, Georgia, growing up in conditions far removed from celebrity. He was born on December 15th, 1958, in a small house built by his grandfather. A house so close to the railroad tracks that trains could be felt before they were heard. It was not the kind of place people would look at and imagine as the starting point of one of country music's defining careers. He grew up as the only boy among 4 sisters in a crowded household where privacy was rare and simplicity was normal. Nothing about that world was glamorous, but it gave him something that would matter far more than glamour ever could. It gave him familiarity with ordinary life. His father, Eugene, worked as a mechanic, and that detail matters because it shaped the kind of man Alan would become. Eugene was not wealthy, influential, or connected. He worked with his hands and earned his living through effort, skill, and repetition. In families like that, dignity is not built around image, it is built around labor. Alan grew up watching that, absorbing it, without realizing how deeply it would later define him. The respect he had for his father's way of life stayed with him, and years later it would become one of the reasons his music felt so believable. He did not have to invent the world he sang about, he came from it. Religion shaped that early life too. The family revolved around church, and it was there that his voice first began to stand out. Not in some polished talent show setting, not in a studio, and not through ambition, but in the ordinary rhythm of worship. He sang old hymns, and people noticed there was something in the way he carried melody that made others stop and turn. But even then, music did not seem like a real future. It was not the kind of dream young Alan Jackson grew up expecting to chase. He was a quiet boy from a small town, and the music business was a distant world that hardly seemed real. When he was old enough, he bought a beat-up guitar and began teaching himself how to play. He learned by ear through repetition and error, not through privilege or professional guidance. There were no family ties to the industry and no one preparing him for stardom. He simply kept at it. That matters because so much of Alan Jackson's image later came to symbolize steadiness and authenticity. And that did not begin after fame. It began in the way he learned, the way he listened, and the way he built his skills alone, one ordinary hour at a time. Even so, talent by itself did not open the door for him. One of the most important turns in his entire life came through Denise, the woman who would become central not only to his personal life, but to his entire story. They married in 1979 as high school sweethearts from the same Georgia town, two young people whose future did not look especially extraordinary from the outside. Denise became a flight attendant while Alan worked odd jobs and played local venues on weekends. Then, in the mid-1980s, she had the kind of encounter that most people would later describe as fate. While working in the Atlanta airport, she recognized Glenn Campbell. Instead of shrinking back or missing the chance, she approached him and spoke to him directly about her husband's dream. Campbell gave her a business card and told her to send Alan to Nashville. Stories like that can sound too convenient when retold, but sometimes real life does hinge on one moment of boldness. That airport conversation became the spark that changed everything. Alan and Denise moved to Nashville with very little, carrying more hope than security. Yet even then, there was no instant breakthrough waiting for him. The early years were hard. He worked in the mailroom at the Nashville network, not as a star in the making, but as someone trying to stay close to the business, while his demo tapes sat ignored. The money was thin, the waiting was long, the rejection was constant. He was not a chosen golden boy entering the industry with momentum behind him. He was another hopeful singer-songwriter trying not to disappear before anyone really noticed he was there. When Arista Nashville finally took a chance on him, everything began to shift. But not because Alan Jackson suddenly reinvented himself. In fact, the opposite is what made him stand out. His debut album, Here in the Real World, introduced an artist whose strength was not flash, but clarity. He sounded grounded. Then came Don't Rock the Jukebox in 1991, and with it came something bigger than commercial success. The song felt like a statement of purpose. At a time when parts of the industry were already moving toward a more polished, crossover-friendly style, Alan Jackson stood almost stubbornly in defense of a sound that still belonged to steel guitars, fiddles, and stories with dirt on their boots. He was not merely succeeding inside country music, he was arguing for what country music was supposed to remain. The success that followed was enormous. Songs like Chattahoochee, Drive, and Gone Country made him one of the dominant artists of his era. The statistics alone were staggering: 35 #1 singles, over 75 million records sold worldwide, 2 Grammy Awards, 16 CMA Awards, and 17 ACM Awards. But numbers do not fully explain why Alan Jackson mattered. Plenty of artists have big careers. What made him different was that audiences trusted him. He never seemed like a man trying on an identity for commercial purposes. Even when fame could have pushed him toward reinvention, he stayed recognizably himself. He sang about the lives his audience actually knew: small towns, work, church, family, memory, regret. He did not package those things as a performance. He treated them as reality. That trust became even more important as the industry around him changed. While Nashville leaned harder into commercial reinvention, Alan Jackson remained what he had always been. He did not suddenly chase pop trends or reshape himself to win younger attention. He could have done it. He had the profile and the resources, but he chose not to. That choice cost him in some ways. It meant less alignment with where the industry wanted to go. It meant fewer rewards from a system increasingly attracted to image, trends, and demographic strategy. Yet it also earned him something stronger than fashion: loyalty. Still, his life was not protected from pain simply because his public image was strong. One of the most damaging chapters of his personal life came through his unfaithfulness to Denise. That betrayal cut deeply because of who she had been to him from the very beginning. This was the woman who had taken a chance on his future before anyone else had reason to believe in it. She had approached Glenn Campbell in an airport. She had supported him through uncertainty. She had gone with him to Nashville when there was no guarantee any of it would work. When their marriage broke under the weight of his choices, it was not just a celebrity scandal. It was a deeply human failure with very public consequences. Their separation was painful, and what ultimately preserved the marriage was not Alan's strength, but Denise's. She turned intensely toward her faith and found in it the ability to forgive. Later, she wrote, "It's all about him," and the title was not about Alan Jackson at all, it was about God. Their reconciliation became one of the more unusual stories in celebrity life because it was not built on clever public relations or surface repair. It rested on the harder work of forgiveness, humility, and survival. Yet even as they rebuilt, the scars remained part of the story. Pain returned again through their daughter Maddie, whose husband, Ben Seligman, died in a boating accident not long after their marriage. That loss brought a different kind of helplessness into Alan's life. It is one thing to endure your own pain. It is another to watch your child suffer and know there is nothing you can do to remove it. For a man whose songs so often reflected memory, family, and emotional truth, that kind of tragedy could not be reduced to a private footnote. It became part of the emotional weight he carried. Years earlier, the entire country had seen another side of that emotional instinct after September 11th, 2001. While millions of Americans were sitting in disbelief, Alan Jackson responded the way he had always processed life, through song. Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning was not an attempt to explain the attacks or turn national grief into spectacle. Its strength came from restraint. He did not offer grand conclusions or political speeches. He simply put into words the stunned, searching question living in so many people. When he performed it at the CMA Awards just weeks later, without build-up or overproduction, the effect was overwhelming. The song became an anthem, not because it was loud, but because it was honest. That same instinct showed itself again in 2010 when devastating floods hit Nashville. Alan Jackson did not simply speak sympathetically from a distance. He contributed significant money and helped support relief efforts in the city that had become central to his life and career. That consistency matters. Whether through song or action, he repeatedly showed that he understood fame did not excuse a person from responsibility. In moments of grief, he leaned toward response rather than detachment. Meanwhile, the transformation he had warned about in country music kept accelerating. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, radio and record labels increasingly favored artists whose sound blended country with pop, rock, and later the party-heavy formulas that came to dominate bro country. Traditional instrumentation faded. The stories that once centered on work, family, and place often gave way to interchangeable songs about trucks, drinking, beaches, and manufactured fun. For listeners who had grown up on country music as a form of truth-telling, this was not just stylistic change, it felt like cultural erasure. The people who once heard themselves in the songs began to feel left out of the genre they had supported for decades. Alan Jackson refused to chase those changes. He could have tried to modernize himself to remain in the middle of the commercial spotlight, but he chose not to. That decision gave his later career a different kind of value. He became, in a sense, a holdout, a reminder, a stubborn piece of continuity in a business that no longer rewarded continuity very much. When George Strait announced his own farewell tour in 2012, it deepened the sense that this generation was slowly stepping away, while the industry turned its back on what they represented. Fans understood what was happening, even if the business did not want to say it out loud. Then, there was the illness. Long before Alan Jackson publicly discussed his diagnosis, he already knew what Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease could do because he had watched it affect his father. The mechanic whose hands had once represented competence, discipline, and dignity had gradually been weakened by a genetic neurological condition that attacks the peripheral nerves. The disease strips away strength and sensation in the hands and feet. It is slow and merciless, and there is no cure. Alan knew it ran in his family. He knew the possibility had always been there. When he later confirmed that he had inherited it, the revelation did not arrive as a random medical twist. It connected back to his father, his family history, and the same working man roots that had shaped his entire identity. Alan Jackson's decline is painful, not just because of illness, but because it strips away the strength and steadiness that defined him. Yet, what makes his goodbye truly heavy is deeper. Fans aren't only losing a man, they're losing what he stood for. He represented a kind of country music rooted in humility, faith, and honesty, a spirit that feels rare today. Songs like Remember When now sound less like nostalgia and more like a quiet acceptance that time takes everything. Through it all, Denise's unwavering presence adds emotional weight to his story. In the end, his farewell doesn't feel like a simple retirement. It feels like the closing of an era.